part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Dennis Manoloff Show, part of the Press Play Podcast Network. I'm your host, Dennis Manoloff. Across the screen from me is the great Jordan Powell, producing and directing. Wanted to take this podcast to cover a variety of non-football topics, beginning with the robbery that was the Australian Open 2022. Rafael Nadal won it. Good for Rafael Nadal. He won his 21st men's singles title to become the sole leader and sole number one in all-time men's single majors in tennis. Good for Nadal. Again, I can't say that enough. But it was an absolute crock that Novak Djokovic did not get a chance to play in that tournament. A complete and utter robbery of Djokovic. Never should have happened. The goofy goofballs in the Australian government, with all their hand-wringing and all their preening and moralizing, because Novak Djokovic didn't get vaccinated. He eventually had his visa revoked, and he wasn't allowed to play in the tournament. Djokovic and Nadal and Roger Federer, all had 20 major wins, singles wins, going into the Australian Open. Federer was a DNP. Djokovic was supposed to play. Nadal wound up playing. Nadal wound up being the only one of the three that played. There is absolutely no excuse for Novak Djokovic not playing in the Australian Open. The Australian government, that country, whatever they want to do with their COVID, okay, whatever. But here's the bottom line. Tennis is its own little pod. The tennis community could have dropped into Melbourne, governed itself where COVID's concerned, and then got the heck out of there. They could have tested themselves. And every day that Novak Djokovic showed up at the tennis facility in Melbourne, he could have been tested. If he tested positive, he didn't play, or he was sent home and probably for the tournament, obviously, because he would have missed at least the one match and he would have been DQ'd. If he tested negative, he should have been allowed to play that day. And keep doing that every day for a fortnight. There's absolutely no reason that Djokovic wasn't allowed into the country to play in a special tournament. This is not like Djokovic was not allowed into the country because he was going to be an explorer of Australia, or he was going to be a tourist guide, or he was going to be a school teacher in 7 different districts in Australia. No, he was coming there to play tennis in the, I'll say infamous, they'll say famous tennis bubble. If you've ever covered tennis, you know what I mean, because I have. Tennis creates a ridiculous bubble. It loves to insulate itself from everybody else. They absolutely could have done that. They were doing it in the Australian Open, but then they pretended like they weren't, or at least Australia disregarded it. All the tennis federations could have gotten together and said, look, Australia, we're coming in for a major. You're happy to have us. We're going to regulate who plays and who doesn't. We're in charge of who plays and who doesn't. None of these players are going to interact with anybody to potentially give them COVID. And if they do interact with fans, it's going to be people who tested negative. Instead, you had Novak Djokovic denied the opportunity to get his 21st title, by the way, at a place that he completely dominates, he completely owns, and you'll never convince me he wouldn't have beaten Nadal. Not as great as Nadal is, Djokovic at this point in their careers, in my mind, would have beaten Nadal, especially in Australia. So it should have been Djokovic 21, Nadal 20, Federer 20. Instead, it's Nadal 21, Djokovic 20, Federer 20, and we don't know when the next time Djokovic is going to play a major because he won't move off this position of not getting vaccinated. And I don't blame him because I believe in personal autonomy, especially when it comes to putting a needle in your arm, especially when it comes to medicines, not vaccines, medicines. That's what this is, a medicine. It's not a vaccine. You don't take 4 polio vaccines to stop getting polio. Why would you take 2, 3, 4 vaccines now to stop COVID? Because it's not a vaccine, it's a medicine. But regardless, whether it's a vaccine or a medicine, I don't tell anybody what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. It's their choice. It's an individual's choice. And if you could prove to me that Novak Djokovic would be a public health emergency by playing in the Australian Open, then I'd listen to the argument. But now that we've shown, as society has moved along in this pandemic, that vaccinated get the COVID, unvaccinated get COVID, vaccinated spread COVID, unvaccinated spread COVID. Nobody's bulletproof. There's no reason to believe that Novak Djokovic would be any more likely to spread COVID than the player he plays against in a given match. And I like my chances of him not spreading it, not getting it, or not having it if I test him every day at the door. And if he doesn't test negative, if he tests positive, then he goes home, period. But he never got that chance because Australia is just dumb and arrogant and stupid. I know dumb and stupid are the same words, so I sound dumb and stupid for saying them together, but that really frustrated me. And not just because I like Novak Djokovic. I'm not that big of a fan of Rafael Nadal, although I respect Nadal's talent. Of the big three, I probably rank, in terms of preference, Federer first, Djokovic second, Nadal third. But honestly, if it were the same situation with Federer getting denied at the door or Nadal getting denied at the door, I'd say the same thing. It's a crock. All right, when we get back on the other side of the upcoming break, we'll talk Baseball Hall of Fame balloting for 2022.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Hey everyone, I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Jeremy Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need each week to get you ready for kickoff and beyond.
Don't miss our breakdowns of each week's matchups, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we all know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
That's right, Jeremy. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of The Orange is Oranger Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
The R&R podcast going to be rocking and rolling with you because football season is underway. College, Ohio State, the Power Fives, the MAC, the Browns. Michael Regai, are you ready to rock and roll with some football?
Kenny, I've been ready. This is our time of year. This is what R&R is all about. We're going to be with you every week. Kenny just said it. Browns, NFL, Ohio State centric. So you got to stay with us all fall and winter long here on R&R.
That's right. The Regai and Rhoda podcast coming to you here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe now and don't miss a show.
Hey, I'm Jason.
And I'm Gary, and we love ball cards.
And if you love ball cards too, good news. You just found your new favorite podcast. From breaks to grading.
And from collecting to flipping, join us on the Ball Card Show.
The sports podcast for the sports collector.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. We read one book a month and then we talk about it. Books like Stephen King's The Shining or Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. If you're on the hunt for book recommendations and enjoy sparkling conversation, come read along with us and then listen in.
Hello, this is Don Mike Mendoza, the host of the Producing While Asian podcast. Join us to listen in on conversations with everyone who identify from producers to non-producers who all are part of the AAPI community. There's all that and more on the Producing While Asian podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network.
This is Mike Voorhees, co-host of the Swing and a Tribe MLB podcast. If you love Cleveland Indians baseball, then this is the pod for you. We've got you covered each week as we talk about all the games, breaking news, trades, the roster, all things Tribe. You're going to love it. Go Tribe.
We're back on the Dennis Manoloff Show, part of the Press Play Podcast Network. The producer is Jordan Powell. National Baseball Hall of Fame balloting has come and gone. I was one of the voters. I've been privileged to be one of the voters for a number of years. I take it very seriously. And this year's ballot, only one player is going to Cooperstown as a result of the BBWAA ballot, and that would be David Ortiz. I think his percentage was 77.9. He had candidates need to get 75% of votes cast. Ortiz getting in was not so much the story as who didn't get in. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, foremost among everybody else on the ballot. Bonds and Clemens in their 10th and final year. If you don't get to the 75% threshold in 10 years, you're off the ballot. And you have to stay on the ballot each year by getting at least 5%. So Clemens and Bonds were able to do that for 10 to get at least 5, and they were up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but they never got to 75%. This year, mid-60s for both guys, mid to high 60s. And I didn't vote for Bonds or Clemens. I didn't vote for Sosa. I didn't vote for Sheffield. I didn't vote for A-Rod. I didn't vote for Manny, because my stance has been preponderance of evidence threshold for PEDs. If there's a preponderance of evidence that you use performance-enhancing drugs, I don't vote for you. It's not me from the bully pulpit. It's not me wagging a finger in anybody's face. It's just me saying that's how I view it. I did vote for David Ortiz as one of my 6. And yes, I understand that David Ortiz had a failed test next to his name in the Mitchell report back in 2003. He was on a list of names that was supposed to be anonymous. It was leaked to the New York Times. I don't care about the anonymous part. What I care about is there was a lot of questions about that particular test, that particular batch, that group of guys. There are pretty much known to be false positives in there. We don't even know what David Ortiz tested positive for. If, in fact, he did test positive, we don't know if he tested positive for a banned substance. So there was enough of a question around that particular group of players in the released report from 2003 that I said I'm willing to go with David Ortiz. And I know that, makes me look to some like a hypocrite. But to me, there wasn't the preponderance of evidence with David Ortiz that there was with Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. And you say, well, Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds never failed an MLB administered test. That's true. But all I ask you to do is read Game of Shadows, co-authored by my former boss at Northwestern, Mark Fainaru-Wada, and Love Me, Hate Me, a story about Barry Bonds by Jeff Pearlman. You read those 2 books, and it's almost impossible to come away from that saying that Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens did not use. The research, detail, sourcing, interviewing in those 2 books alone is epic. And that's just 2 books, by the way. There have been plenty of other things written about Bonds and Clemens, what they dabbled in, exactly what they dabbled in, people testifying to that effect, receipts, names of the actual drugs, and on and on and on. So in my mind, Ortiz did not meet the preponderance of evidence, whereas Bonds, Clemens, Sosa, McGuire when he was on the ballot, Sheffield, A-Rod. They did. What's interesting to me is once the finality of it was known that Bonds and Clemens weren't going to get in on the BBWA ballot, they could still get in on the Today's Era committee that its next meeting is December. We'll see, if the Today's Era committee wants to go that way. They think you need a 75% yes out of 16 guys or gals. You need 12. What was interesting and bothersome to me was the criticism that those of us who didn't vote for Bonds and Clemens took. And, and some of them were some of the tenets of the criticism were the typical nonsense. They were Hall of Famers before they'd used or allegedly used. So why can't you just give them the Hall of Fame because they were going to be Hall of Famers anyway? That's idiotic. You've heard me on these airwaves on this podcast say it before. I'll say it again. You're taking a proctored test. It's 100 questions. You get 99 right. On the 100th question, you cheat. What's the grade you're going to get? What's the status of your test? You're going to get a 99 out of 100? No, you're not. You're going to get an F, or you're going to fail, or you're going to get expelled. So you were headed toward a perfect score, and then you cheated. You don't get a near perfect score. You get a 0. Where else in life does it work where you can be a citizen of the year and then do something horrific, and because you were going to be a citizen of the year, or you had been, that it's all good? So I'm a law-abiding citizen. I don't do anything wrong, not so much as a parking ticket, and then I hold up a bank, God forbid, armed robbery. I'm convicted of armed robbery. Do you think in the courtroom they're going to say, you know what, Dennis, you were a really good citizen before you committed that armed robbery. You're good. We'll let this one slide, this armed robbery slide, because you were good before that. Come on now. That's lunacy. And you have another tale that's being spun by Bonds and Clemens supporters that you can't tell the history of baseball without Bonds and Clemens. No, you can't. That's true. You can't tell the history of baseball, in my mind, without Bonds or Clemens or Pete Rose. But where I differ from those who hold that position is, I say you tell the story of baseball with Bonds and Clemens and Rose and others and other PEDers, not Rose as a PEDer, but Rose as a banned from baseball guy. But you don't have to induct him into the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York is allowed at this second, can make up its own mind. The Hall of Fame in New York, in Cooperstown, New York, can do whatever the heck it wants to do regarding Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, any of the PEDers. The Hall of Fame can build a steroid era wing if it wants to. The Hall of Fame era can build a wing devoted to Barry Bonds' career if it wants to. It can build a statue in the middle of the main atrium of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens if it wants to. Nothing is stopping the Hall of Fame from telling the story of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens any way it sees fit. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are already in the Hall of Fame in various ways, tied to the teams they played on, tied to historic moments that they both produced, awards they won. So the story of baseball is being told with Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens included. The story of baseball is being told with Pete Rose included in the Hall of Fame. His name is mentioned. I believe there's still artifacts on display of Pete Rose's career. Maybe not, because he's banned from baseball. Bonds and Clemens are not banned from baseball. So maybe they took everything that has Rose's name on it out of there. I can't remember. But at the very least with the PED guys, go ahead. and tell the story of baseball with Bonds and Clemens. You just don't have to induct them into the Hall of Fame. They don't have to be inducted. There are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of artifacts in the Baseball Hall of Fame that have nothing to do with enshrinees, have nothing to do with those who are Hall of Fame or who have plaques. There are, countless names mentioned along with those artifacts and memorabilia in the Hall of Fame that are names of guys who haven't been inducted. So this idea that you can't have a Hall of Fame and museum if you don't induct Bonds and Clemens is lunacy. It's just dumb. The baseball writers are not preventing the curators and the sponsors in Cooperstown from telling the story of the steroid era. And I was at the Hall of Fame a few years ago for Jim Thome's induction. I didn't go through the entire hall. Maybe there is a steroid era wing or a steroid era explanation. I just didn't have time to get through the whole museum. I don't know if there is or there isn't. But there's nothing the baseball writers did with this ballot that denies the story of Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire and Gary Sheffield and Rafael Palmeiro and Alex Rodriguez from being told. And if you're so desperate to tell it to your kids, as I heard some of these writers who should know better, who voted for Bonds and Clemens, tell it to your kids. You don't need to haul them to Cooperstown and say, hey, guess what, kids? Here's Bonds and Clemens in the Hall of Fame. Or if they're not there, say, hey, kids, you want to know why Bonds and Clemens aren't in the Hall? Well, I'll tell you why. Tell them right now. Nothing's stopping you. You don't need to go to Cooperstown to do it. And what I've said all along, too, about my vote is not even so much to deny Bonds, Clemens, and the gang, the preponderance of evidence PEDers. My vote is to try to stick up for the innocent ones. And one of the innocent ones, Doug Glanville, a brilliant guy, just a great mind. Doug Glanville wrote a tour de force piece on ESPN.com, and I urge you all to go find it. Headline, Doug Glanville, why I'm okay with Barry Bonds not being elected to the Hall of Fame. I'll read you a graph from it. I've thought about those days a lot recently as the end of the Barry Bonds candidacy on the BBWA ballot approached. Even before the announcement last week, as I read more and more about the importance of Bonds' inclusion into the Hall as a historic necessity, I started to worry. He may actually get in. For me, this wasn't just about Bonds. It was about so many extraordinary productive players from my era, too many of whom used PEDs. For weeks before the vote was announced, I imagined watching a parade of PED players walk up to the podium to tell us about their journey, knowing they represent a force that accelerated the demise of so many players who played it straight. Congratulations, ? And on it goes. An incredible essay by Doug Glanville. Please read it on ESPN.com. Glanville hit so many points that I've tried to say too. I mean, and Doug Glanville was one of those who played it clean, didn't have a monster career, but was adversely affected to some degree by having to go up against lab creations. I think about Kenny Lofton. In Cleveland, we should always think about Kenny Lofton. Those who say, oh, you should vote for the PEDers. Oh, really? Well, let's see. Kenny Lofton didn't do PEDs, never a whiff. Kenny Lofton was a speed guy. He was a base runner. He was a disruptor. He wasn't a power guy. He played in the steroid era. Well, guess what? His value was diminished by lab creations, by juicers. The value of his game was diminished. And in my mind, he's right there as a debatable Hall of Famer. If his skill set hadn't been diminished in the steroid era, maybe he'd be in the Hall of Fame. Jim Thome. Again, like Lofton, not a whiff of PEDs, played it clean. I'll go to my grave believing in Kenny Lofton and Jim Thome. I saw them up close day after day after day, year after year when I was working for the Plain Dealer and part of the Indians coverage team. There's no way in the world that neither one of those guys touched anything related to PEDs. They believed in themselves. They believed in their system. They believed in their work ethic, their coaching, and their innate ability. They weren't going to touch that stuff. Jim Thome's, one of the great sluggers in the history of the game, made it to the Hall, yes, but he doesn't deserve to have whispers surrounding him. He doesn't deserve to say, well, everybody did it back then. Well, if you say everybody did it, that means you must have included Jim Thome, which is wrong because he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Albert Pujols, clean as a whistle. I don't even want to mention Albert Pujols' name in the same sentence as you know what, because I don't want Albert Pujols' people coming after me. I'm 100,000% positive that Pujols never touched anything relating to anything illegal or a banned. The problem for Pujols and Thome is they have to hear at least the whispers because they played in the era with the cheats. They didn't cheat. They did it the right way, but you don't have the appreciation maybe that you should because they were surrounded by too many cheats. And when I was listening to the analysis and the Bonds apologists in the media, the Clemens apologists in the media, who were willing to acknowledge that Bonds and Clemens did PEDs, even if they didn't flunk a test. They were saying, yeah, they did them, but still they deserved to get in. It was astonishing to me. I never heard any mention of the clean guys, the clean sluggers like Pujols, the clean sluggers like Thome, the clean sluggers like Ken Griffey Jr., Frank Thomas. And I'm not trying to leave anybody out, but I'm just thinking of those names off the top of my head. The clean table setters like Kenny Lofton. Before you go hitch your wagon to suspected PED guys, how about you think about all the damage that those guys did to the game and the damage that they did to players where they might have prematurely ended their careers, as Glanville was alluding to. You had pitchers who chose not to use, and maybe their numbers were terrible because they were giving up 500-foot bombs and they were out of the game earlier than they should have been. You had hitters who didn't juice, who might have been out of the game earlier than they should have been because they weren't able to keep up with the Joneses, as it were. How about you think about the guys who didn't use and stop with the blanket statement, well, if Bonds and Clemens and Sosa and Sheffield and those guys supposedly used, then everybody must have used. No, that's not true. Not everybody used. I would submit not even close to the majority used. Yes, it was a problem for baseball. It was a serious problem, but not everybody used. And you need to stick up for the clean guys like Pujols and Thome and Lofton and Griffey and Thomas. And you're also, when you think about the era, I'm old enough to have been writing for the Plain Dealer and helping to cover baseball during the steroid era. I heard and read and, I wrote some about how terrible the steroid era is on the game. Staying on the game. The worst thing that could have happened to the game since the Black Sox. Awful, awful, awful. Steroid era. Oh, my gosh. Baseball's awful. How's it ever going to recover? Black eye for baseball. On and went. Reams of copy. Broadcast, radio, TV, everything. Steroid era. Terrible, 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 terrible. Well, guess what? Some of these same people are now saying it's not that big of a deal. What's changed? What's changed about the steroid era? I submit nothing's changed. It remains a black eye for baseball. It was cheating. cheating is what cheating is. It's cheating. It doesn't get softened. If we go by that standard, that the steroid era is already not a black eye for baseball. It's already not a stain on the game. Less than, 20 years removed from it. Well, less than 25 years removed from it at its height. Well, then why is the Black Sox scandal still a scandal? Why haven't we softened our stance on the 1919 Black Sox throwing the World Series against the Reds? I mean, you would think by now we would just be like, throwing games is throwing games. Pete Rose betting on games, no big deal. No. You got to take a stance somewhere. What are we supposed to do in 10 years? Just soften our stance on the Houston Astros and how they cheated with their elaborate sign stealing mechanisms electronically and all that other crap that earned their manager, A.J. Hinch, a 1-year suspension, and their GM. I think the GM was booted for a year. And the stigma attached to all those Astros players who won the title in 2017, we're supposed to just let that slide in a few years? No. You can't sit there and turn a blind eye to cheating. If the steroid era was bad back then, it's bad now. So I don't feel like I have to apologize for my picks, even though Ortiz comes with some controversy. My other picks, Curt Schilling, Todd Helton, Jeff Kent, Bobby Abreu, and Scott Rowland. And I know that, and Curt Schilling not getting in is a complete and utter crack, because the only reason he didn't get in was not PEDs he never used, never a hint of PEDs for Schilling. So I guess you could add him to the list of people I'm trying to protect, but as far as the innocent ones. But Schilling, because of politics, it's just obscene, absolutely absurd. He didn't get in because enough writers didn't like his views, didn't like him as that as the prevention of getting you into the hall is lunacy. Curt Schilling has never broken any laws that I know of. He's never done anything. He had a business dealing go bad, gaming company, but he's been a model sin as far as, the police dockets go. He's a great fan. He had Hall of Fame credentials on the field. The thing that's kept him out of Cooperstown, that denied him for 10 years on the ballot, because he was on the same ballot at the same time as Clemens and Bonds, was the fact that his political didn't match up with the writers. And he offended a lot of the writers with stuff that he said. So these same writers who kept Schilling out, those reasons, want to lecture me about keeping Bonds and Clemens out for PED use. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? All right, that time. It's time to wrap it up, and I've kept Donald long enough. I really appreciate Jordan taking the time. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll talk.